Bullies have no clue. They just attacked the president's son. Imagine being attacked by a group of bullies, humiliated and beaten for no reason. Now imagine those same bullies realizing they just made the worst mistake of their lives. What if the person they just targeted wasn't just an ordinary student, but the son of the most powerful man in the country? This is the story of Jake, a quiet young man who just wanted a normal day at school, but a group of cruel kids decided to make him their target. What they didn't know was that by messing with him, they were playing with fire. Fire that could burn their lives to the ground. But would his father use his power for revenge? Or would this story take an even more shocking turn? Stay until the end, because this story has a twist no one saw coming. Jake never liked standing out. Even though his father was the president of the country, he made sure to live a simple life. His identity was kept secret for security reasons, and at school, he was just another regular student. But that day, things would be different. During lunch break, as he walked through the courtyard, he suddenly felt a hard shove from behind. His lunch tray slipped from his hands, and before he could react, a foot stomped down on his food. "Well, well, look who's daydreaming," sneered Mark, the leader of the bullies. Jake sighed and tried to walk away, but another boy, Troy, stepped in his path. "Where do you think you're going, loser?" Troy smirked, crossing his arms. Other students started to gather around, forming a circle. Jake knew that fighting back would only make things worse. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. But the bullies had no intention of letting him go. Mark punched Jake in the shoulder, making him stumble. Laughter echoed through the crowd. "What's wrong? Gonna cry?" one of the boys mocked. Jake looked around, realizing no one would help him. Some students just watched in silence, while others had their phones out, recording the scene. That's when Mark made the decision that would change everything. He grabbed Jake by the collar and spat, "You're a nobody, a weakling." And then he shoved him to the ground. Jake hit the pavement but didn't say a word. He just stared up at Mark with a look that made the bully hesitate for a second. What no one knew was that this nobody was the president's son. And everything that had just happened was caught on camera. The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was all over the school. By the end of the day, it had reached the internet. And by the next morning, it had gone viral. At first, Mark and his gang didn't care. In fact, they were proud. They laughed as they watched the video, pointing out how weak Jake looked when he hit the ground. "Look at that. He didn't even fight back," Mark chuckled. "Man, we should have done more," Troy added. They had no idea what was coming. At that very moment, in a heavily guarded presidential estate, a man in a sharp black suit watched the same video. His face remained expressionless, but his grip on the phone tightened. President William Carter was not just any leader. He was a man known for his firm hand and unwavering sense of justice. And now he was watching his only son being humiliated in front of the entire world. A cold silence filled the room. Then, without looking up, he spoke. "Who are they?" An aide stepped forward. "We've already identified the boys, sir. Mark Reynolds, Troy Bennett, and 2 others, high school seniors. Their parents, well, they're about to receive some very unpleasant calls." President Carter didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at the screen, replaying the moment his son was shoved to the ground, over and over again. Then, in a voice that sent chills through the room, he finally said, "Bring them to me." The news broke before Mark and his friends even had time to react. By lunchtime, the school was in chaos. Teachers whispered nervously, students checked their phones in shock, and the bullies themselves, they were terrified, because suddenly everyone knew. Jake Carter wasn't just some random kid. He was the son of the President of the United States, and they had just attacked him on camera. Mark's hands started to sweat as he scrolled through the news. "No way," he muttered. Troy grabbed his phone, his face turning pale as he read the headlines. "Bullies brutally attack President's son, caught on camera." "Breaking, President Carter responds to viral video of his son's assault. Arrests imminent. White House confirms investigation. Dude, we're screwed, Troy whispered. Mark swallowed hard. This wasn't a joke anymore. This wasn't just another dumb prank. They had attacked the one person in the country they should have never touched. And now, the most powerful man in the nation was coming for them. Panic spread like wildfire. By the time Mark, Troy, and the others arrived at school the next morning, everyone was staring. Some whispered, others pointed, a few even filmed them just like they had done to Jake. But this time, the cameras weren't in their favor. "Dude, people are looking at us weird," one of the bullies muttered. Mark clenched his jaw and walked faster. He could feel his stomach twisting. That's when his phone buzzed. He pulled it out and his hands instantly turned cold. "New message from Mom. We need to talk, now. Call me immediately." Troy checked his phone at the same time. His face went pale. "My dad just texted me. He says we might need a lawyer." Mark felt like the floor was crumbling beneath him. A lawyer? This was getting way too real. As they reached their lockers, a student walked past them and muttered, "You guys are so dead." Then the principal's voice boomed through the intercom. "Mark Reynolds, Troy Bennett, and Ethan Carter. Please report to the main office immediately." Silence fell over the hallway. Someone whispered, "It's happening." Mark swallowed hard. Troy grabbed his arm. "Bro, what do we do?" Mark didn't answer. He just started walking, his legs feeling heavier with every step. When they turned the corner, two men in dark suits were waiting. Secret Service. This wasn't a joke anymore. This was the beginning of the end. Mark and Troy barely had time to breathe before the agents stepped forward. "Come with us," one of them said, his voice cold and professional. The two boys exchanged a panicked glance. But what choice did they have? Without a word, they followed. The school principal, standing nearby, looked pale as a ghost. Even the receptionist avoided eye contact. Everyone knew this wasn't just another trip to the office. This was serious. The hallway felt endless, but soon enough, they were led out of the school and into a black SUV with tinted windows. As the doors shut behind them, Mark's heart pounded. Are we under arrest?" Troy stammered. One of the agents turned to them. "Not yet." That single word sent a chill down Mark's spine. The drive was silent. Every passing street, every turn, took them further from their comfort zone. Then, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived. The White House. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He had seen it 1,000 times on TV, but now, he was about to walk inside, and not as a guest. As they were escorted through security, the reality of their situation hit like a freight train. They weren't just in trouble. They were in the worst trouble of their lives. And waiting for them, behind those heavy double doors, was the President of the United States, and he was not happy. The room was large, intimidating. Mark and Troy stood frozen as the doors shut behind them. At the far end of the room, sitting behind a massive oak desk, was President William Carter. He didn't speak at first. He just stared. The silence was unbearable. Then finally, he placed his hands on the desk and leaned forward. "Do you have any idea," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "what you've done?" Mark's throat was dry. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. Troy, shaking, whispered, "Sir, we didn't know." The president cut him off. "That my son was the one you were tormenting." His eyes burned with restrained fury. "So tell me, does that make it better?" Neither of them answered. President Carter exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "I have seen many things in my career. Wars, political betrayals, economic disasters. But what I saw in that video," he leaned back, his expression unreadable, "that was nothing but cowardice." Mark felt a lump in his throat. The president continued, "You humiliated a boy who never did anything to you. You laughed while he was on the ground. And worst of all, He paused, his voice lowering. You enjoyed it. Troy's hands were trembling. Mark could feel his entire body sweating. This was worse than any punishment they had ever faced. This was judgment, and it wasn't over yet. Mark felt like he couldn't breathe. The weight of the president's words crushed him more than any punishment he had ever received in his life. But then, something unexpected happened. President Carter leaned back in his chair and studied them, his expression unreadable. "Tell me," he said, his voice quieter now. "What should I do with you?" Mark and Troy exchanged a glance, their minds racing. What did he mean? Would they be arrested, expelled, their families ruined? Troy swallowed hard. "Sir, we're sorry," he stammered. "We didn't know who he was. If we had—" The president slammed his hand on the desk, making both of them jump. "That's the problem." His voice was sharp now, filled with anger. "If you had known, you wouldn't have touched him, but because you thought he was just some nobody, you felt entitled to torment him." Silence. The truth of his words hung heavy in the air. Mark's chest tightened. He had never felt so small. President Carter sighed, rubbing his temples. "I could destroy your futures," he said matter-of-factly. "One call and you'd be expelled. Another and every college you apply to would reject you. I could have your families blacklisted from every opportunity imaginable." Mark felt his knees go weak. Troy looked like he was about to pass out. "But," the president continued, "I'm not going to do that." Their eyes widened in shock. "Instead, I'm going to teach you a lesson in a way you'll never forget." 2 days later, Mark and Troy were taken somewhere unexpected. Not a jail, not a courtroom, a homeless shelter. They were handed aprons and rubber gloves. The director of the shelter, a no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Ruiz, crossed her arms and glared at them. "You think you're tough?" she said. "Let's see how tough you are cleaning floors and serving food to people who actually have real problems." For the next 3 months, Mark and Troy spent every weekend working at that shelter. They scrubbed filthy bathrooms. They served food to people who had lost everything, and slowly they began to change. Mark, once full of arrogance, found himself sitting down and listening to the stories of those who had nothing. Troy, who used to laugh at people's pain, now saw real suffering up close. They started to realize how cruel they had been, and the more they worked, the more the weight of their past actions settled in their hearts. One evening, as Mark wiped down a table, he noticed someone familiar. Jake, standing at the entrance, watching them. Mark froze. He expected Jake to gloat, to mock them, to throw their humiliation back in their faces, but Jake just gave a small nod and walked away. No words, no revenge, just closure. And somehow, that was worse than any punishment they could have imagined. The weeks passed, and something strange happened. At first, Mark and Troy had hated every second of working at the shelter. The exhaustion, the humiliation, the feeling of being powerless. It was unbearable. But then, things started to change. One night, as Mark handed a bowl of soup to an elderly man, the man smiled at him and said, "Thank you, son. You don't know how much this means." Mark felt something shift inside him. He had spent so much of his life tearing people down, making them feel small. But here, a simple act of kindness could mean everything to someone. Troy, who had always been the loud, arrogant type, found himself sitting with a little girl whose parents had lost their jobs. She was drawing on a napkin, and when she looked up at him with innocent eyes and said, "Are you a bad guy?" he nearly choked. I don't know," he admitted. She just smiled. "Bad guys don't help people. You're helping." And for the first time in a long time, Troy wanted to be better. After 3 months, their punishment was over. They had served their time. They had done the work. But now they faced one last challenge. Back at school, people still whispered about them. Some still mocked them for their downfall. And then one day, they walked past a group of kids picking on a smaller boy. Mark froze. The same situation, the same cruelty, the same power dynamic. But this time, he wasn't the bully. He was the one who stepped forward and said, "Leave him alone." The bullies turned, sneering. "Or what?" one of them challenged. Mark didn't threaten them. He didn't throw a punch. He just looked them in the eye and said, "You don't want to go down this road. Trust me." Troy stepped up beside him, arms crossed. And for the first time in their lives, they weren't feared. They were respected. And that was worth more than anything. Some people change, some don't. Mark and Troy had a choice: return to their old ways or become better than they were before. And though the journey wasn't easy, they took the harder path. They apologized to Jake. They stopped chasing popularity. And when graduation came, they both applied for college, not as bullies, but as young men who had learned the hardest lesson of their lives. Because power doesn't come from stepping on others. It comes from lifting them up, and they would never forget that again. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever seen someone change for the better? Do you believe that bullies can truly redeem themselves? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a powerful story like this one. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is redemption.